Okay, so last time we read, um, we stopped at chapter 9. We finished chapter 9, and Zero asked Stanley about the sneakers, and Zero asked Stanley, did they have X's on them? And Stanley found out that when they were calling someone caveman, they were talking about Stanley, because we learned that all of the boys at the camp have nicknames. So obviously, Zero, Armpit, Zigzag, those are not their real names, those are nicknames, fun names that they've made for each other. So, and remember too that Stanley was writing a letter to his mom, and Zero looked over his shoulder, and then Zero asked about the sneakers. So that's kind of where we left off. Chapter 10. Stanley had no trouble falling asleep, but morning came much too quickly. Every muscle and joint in his body ached as he tried to get out of bed. He didn't think it was possible, but his body hurt more than it had the day before. It wasn't just his arms and back, but his legs, ankles, and waist also hurt. The only thing that got him out of bed was knowing that every second he wasted meant he was 1 second closer to the rising of the sun. He hated the sun. He could hardly lift his spoon during breakfast, and then he was out on the lake, his spoon replaced by a shovel. He found a crack in the ground and began his second hole. He stepped on the shovel blade and pushed on the very back of the shaft with the base of his thumb. This hurt less than trying to hold the shaft with his blistered fingers. As he dug, he was careful to dump the dirt far away from the hole. He needed to save the area around the hole for when his hole was much deeper. He didn't know if he'd ever get that far. X-Ray was right. The second hole was the hardest. It would take a miracle. As long as the sun wasn't out yet, he removed his cap and used it to help protect his hands. Once the sun rose, he would have to put it back on his head. His neck and forehead had been badly burned the day before. He took it one shovelful at a time and tried not to think of the awesome task that lay ahead of him. After an hour or so, his sore muscles seemed to loosen up a little bit. He grunted as he tried to stick his shovel into the dirt. His cap slipped out from under his fingers, and the shovel fell free. He let it lie there. He took a drink from his canteen. He guessed that the water truck should be coming soon, but he didn't finish all the water, just in case he was wrong. He'd learned to wait until he saw the truck before drinking the last drop. The sun wasn't yet up, but its rays arced over the horizon and brought light to the sky. He reached down to pick up his cap, and there next to it he saw a wide, flat rock. As he put his cap on his head, he continued to look down at the rock. He picked it up. He thought he could see the shape of a fish, fossilized in it. He rubbed off some dirt, and the outline of the fish became clearer. The sun peeked over the horizon, and he could actually see tiny lines where every one of the fish's bones had been. He looked at the barren land all around him. True, everyone referred to this area as the lake, but it was still hard to believe that this dry wasteland was once full of water. Then he remembered what Mr. Sir and Mr. Pendanski had both said. If he dug up anything interesting, he should report it to one of them. If the warden liked it, he would get the rest of the day off. He looked back down at his fish. He'd found his miracle. He continued to dig, though very slowly, as he waited for the water truck. He didn't want to bring attention to his find, afraid that one of the boys might try to take it from him. He tossed the rock face down beside his dirt pile, as if it had no special value. A short while later, he saw the cloud of dirt heading across the lake. The truck stopped and the boys lined up. They always lined up in the same order, Stanley realized, no matter who got there first. X-Ray was always at the front of the line. Then came Armpit, Squid, Zigzag, Magnet, and Zero. Stanley got in line behind Zero. He was glad to be at the very back, so no one would notice the fossil. His pants had very large pockets, but the rock still made a bulge. Mr. Pendanski filled each boy's canteen, until Stanley was the only one left. I found something, Stanley said, taking it out of his pocket. Mr. Pendanski reached for Stanley's canteen, but Stanley handed him the rock instead. What's this? It's a fossil, said Stanley. See the fish? Mr. Pendanski looked at it again. See, you can even see all of its little bones, said Stanley. Interesting, said Mr. Pendanski. Let me have your canteen. Stanley handed it to him. Mr. Pendanski filled it, then returned it. So, do I get the rest of the day off? What for? You said if I found something interesting, the warden would give me the day off. Mr. Pendanski laughed as he gave the fossil back to Stanley. Sorry, Stanley. The warden isn't interested in fossils. Let me see that, said Magnet, taking the rock from Stanley. Stanley continued to stare at Mr. Pendanski. Hey, Zig, dig this rock. Cool, said Zigzag. Stanley saw his fossil being passed around. I don't see nothing, said X-Ray. He took off his glasses, wiped them on his dirty clothes, and put them back on. See, look at the little fishy, said Armpit. Chapter 11. Stanley returned to his hole. It wasn't fair. Mr. Pendanski had said his fossil was interesting. He slammed his shovel into the ground and pried up another piece of earth. After a while, he noticed X-Ray had come by and was watching him dig. Hey, caveman, let me talk to you a second, X-Ray said. Stanley put down his shovel and stepped up out of his hole. Say, listen, said X-Ray. If you find something else, give it to me, okay? Stanley wasn't sure what to say. X-Ray was clearly the leader of the group, and Stanley didn't want to get on his bad side. You're new here, right? Said X-Ray. I've been here for almost a year. I've never found anything. You know, my eyesight's not so good. No one knows this, but you know why my name's X-Ray? Stanley shrugged one shoulder. It's Pig Latin for Rex, that's all. I'm too blind to find anything. Stanley tried to remember how Pig Latin worked. I mean, X-Ray went on, why should you get a day off when you've only been here a couple of days? If anybody gets a day off, it should be me. That's only fair, right? I guess, Stanley agreed. X-Ray smiled. You're a good guy, caveman. Stanley picked up his shovel. The more he thought about it, the more he was glad that he agreed to let X-Ray have anything he might find. If he was going to survive at Camp Green Lake, it was far more important that X-Ray think he was a good guy than it was for him to get one day off. Besides, he didn't expect to find anything anyway. There probably wasn't anything of interest out there, and even if there was, he'd never been what you call lucky. He slammed his blade into the ground, then dumped out another shovelful of dirt. It was a little surprising, he thought, that X-Ray was the leader of the group, since he obviously wasn't the biggest or the toughest. In fact, except for Zero, X-Ray was the smallest. Armpit was the biggest. Zigzag may have been taller than Armpit, but that was only because of his neck. Yet Armpit and all the others seemed to be willing to do whatever X-Ray asked of them. As Stanley dug up another shovelful of dirt, it occurred to him that Armpit wasn't the biggest. He, the caveman, was bigger. He was glad they called him caveman. It meant they accepted him as a member of the group. He would have been glad even if they called him Barfbag. It was really quite remarkable to him. At school, bullies like Derek Dunn used to pick on him. Yet Derek Dunn would be scared senseless by any of the boys here. As he dug his hole, Stanley thought about what it would be like if Derek Dunn had to fight Armpit or Squid. Derek wouldn't stand a chance. He imagined what it would be like if he became good friends with all of them, and then for some reason they all went with him to his school, and then Derek Dunn tried to steal his notebook. Just what do you think you're doing? Asked Squid as he slammed his hands into Derek Dunn's smug face. Caveman's our friend, says Armpit, grabbing him by the shirt collar. Stanley played the scene over and over again in his mind, each time watching another boy from Group D beat up Derek Dunn. It helped him dig his hole and ease his own suffering. Whatever pain he felt was being felt 10 times worse by Derek. So remember, Derek was the bully who stole his notebook on the day that he got arrested. As remember, at school, Stanley doesn't really have any friends. Chapter 12. Again, Stanley was the last one to finish digging. It was late afternoon when he dragged himself back to the compound. This time he would have accepted a ride on the truck if it was offered. When he got to the tent, he found Mr. Pendanski and the other boys sitting in a circle on the ground. Welcome, Stanley, said Mr. Pendanski. Hey, caveman, you get your hole dug? Asked Magnet. He managed to nod. You spit in it? Asked Squid. He nodded again. You're right, he said to X-Ray. The second hole's the hardest. X-Ray shook his head. The third hole's the hardest, he said. Come join our circle, said Mr. Pendanski. Stanley plopped down between Squid and Magnet. He needed to rest up before taking a shower. We've been discussing what we want to do with our lives, said Mr. Pendanski. We're not going to be at Camp Green Lake forever. We need to prepare for the day we leave here and join the rest of society. Hey, that's great, Mom, said Magnet. They're going to finally let you out of here? The other boys laughed. Okay, Jose, said Mr. Pendanski. What do you want to do with your life? I don't know, said Magnet. You need to think about that, said Mr. Pendanski. It's important to have goals. Otherwise, you're going to end up right back in jail. What do you like to do? I don't know, said Magnet. You must like something, said Mr. Pendanski. I like animals, said Magnet. Good, said Mr. Pendanski. Does anyone know of any jobs that involve animals? Veterinarian, said Armpit. That's right, said Mr. Pendanski. He could work in a zoo, said Zigzag. He belongs in the zoo, said Squid. Then he and X-Ray laughed. How about you, Stanley? Any ideas for Jose? Stanley sighed. Animal trainer, he said, like for the circus or movies or something like that. Any of those jobs sound good to you, Jose? Asked Mr. Pendanski. Yeah, I like what Caveman said about training animals for movies. I think it would be fun to train monkeys. X-Ray laughed. Don't laugh, Rex, said Mr. Pendanski. We don't laugh at people's dreams. Someone is going to have to train monkeys for the movies. Are you kidding, Mom? Asked X-Ray. Magnet's never going to be a monkey trainer. You don't know that, said Mr. Pendanski. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. Nothing in life is easy, but that's no reason to give up. You'll be surprised at what you can accomplish if you set your mind to it. After all, you only have one life, so you should try to make the most of it. Stanley tried to figure out what he'd say if Mr. Pendanski asked him what he wanted to do with his life. He used to think he wanted to work for the FBI, but this didn't seem the appropriate place to mention that. So far, you've all done a pretty good job at messing up your lives, said Mr. Pendanski. I know you think you're cool. He looked at Stanley. So you're a caveman now, huh? You like digging holes, caveman? Stanley didn't know what to say. Well, let me tell you something, caveman. You are here on account of one person. If it wasn't for that one person, you wouldn't be here digging holes in the hot sun. You know who that person is? My no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. The other boys howled with laughter. Even Zero smiled. It was the first time Stanley had ever seen Zero smile. He usually had such an angry expression on his face. Now he had such a huge smile it almost seemed too big for his face, like the smile on a jack-o'-lantern. No, said Mr. Pendanski. That person is you, Stanley. You're the reason you're here. You're responsible for yourself. You messed up your life, and it's up to you to fix it. No one else is going to do it for you. For any of you. Mr. Pendanski looked from one boy to the other. You're all special in your own way, he said. You've all got something to offer. You have to think about what you want to do, then do it. Even you, Zero. You're not completely worthless. The smile was now gone from Zero's face. What do you want to do with your life? Mr. Pendanski asked him. Zero's mouth was shut tight. As he glared at Mr. Pendanski's dark eyes seemed to expand. What about it, Zero? Asked Mr. Pendanski. What do you like to do? I like to dig holes. Chapter 13. All too soon, Stanley was back out on the lake, sticking his shovel into the dirt. X-Ray was right. The third hole was the hardest. So was the fourth hole, and the fifth hole, and the sixth, and He dug his shovel into the dirt. After a while, he lost track of the day of the week and how many holes he dug. It all seemed like one big hole, and it would take 1.5 years to dig it. He guessed he'd lost at least 5 pounds. He figured that in 1.5 years, he'd be either in great physical condition or else dead. He dug his shovel into the dirt. He couldn't always be this hot, he thought. Surely it got cooler in December. Maybe then they froze. He dug his shovel into the dirt. His skin had gotten tougher. It hadn't hurt so much to hold the shovel. It didn't hurt so much. As he drank from his canteen, he looked up at the sky. A cloud had appeared earlier in the day. It was the first cloud he could remember seeing since coming to Camp Green Lake. He and the other boys had been watching it all day, hoping it would move in front of the sun. Occasionally, it got close, but it was just teasing them. His hole was waist deep. He dug his shovel into the dirt. As he dumped it out, he thought he saw something glisten as it fell into the dirt pile. Whatever it was quickly buried. Stanley stared at the pile a moment, unsure if he'd even seen it. Even if it was something, what good would it do him? He'd promised to give anything he found to X-Ray. It didn't seem worth the effort to climb out of his hole to check it out. He glanced up at the cloud, which was close enough to the sun that he had to squint to look at it. He dug his shovel back into the earth, scooped out some dirt, and lifted it over his dirt pile. But instead of dumping it there, he tossed it off to the side. His curiosity had gotten the better of him. He climbed up out of his hole and sifted his fingers through the pile. He felt something hard and metallic. He pulled it out. It was a gold tube, about as long and as wide as the second finger on his right hand. The tube was open at one end and closed at the other. He used a few drops of his precious water to clean it. There seemed to be some kind of design on the flat, closed end. He poured a few more drops of water on it and rubbed it in the inside of his pants pocket. He looked again at the design engraved on the flat bottom of the tube. He could see an outline of a heart with the letters KB etched inside it. He tried to figure out some way that he wouldn't have to give it to X-Ray. He could just keep it, but that wouldn't do him any good. He wanted a day off. He looked at the large piles of dirt near where X-Ray was digging. X-Ray was probably almost finished for the day. Getting the rest of the day off would hardly do him much good. X-ray would first have to show the tube to Mr. Sir or Mr. Pendanski, who would then have to show it to the warden. By then, X-ray might be done anyway. Stanley wondered about trying to secretly take the tube directly to the warden. He could explain the situation to the warden, and the warden might make up an excuse for giving him the day off, so X-ray wouldn't suspect. He looked across the lake toward the cabin under the 2 oak trees. The place scared him. He'd been at Camp Green Lake almost 2 weeks, and he still hadn't seen the warden. That was just as well. If he could go his entire year and a half without seeing the warden, that would be fine with him. Besides, he didn't know if the warden would find the tube interesting. He looked at it again. It looked familiar. He thought he'd seen something like it somewhere before, but couldn't quite place it. "What you got there, caveman?" asked Zigzag. Stanley's large hand closed around the tube. "Nothing, just, It was useless. "I think I might have found something." "Another fossil?" "No, I'm not sure what it is." "Let me see," said Zigzag. Instead of showing it to Zigzag, Stanley brought it to X-ray. Zigzag followed. X-ray looked at the tube, then rubbed his dirty glasses on his dirty shirt and looked at the tube again. One by one, the other boys dropped their shovels and came to look. "It looks like an old shotgun shell," said Squid. "Yeah, that's probably what it is," said Stanley. He decided not to mention the engraved design. Maybe nobody would notice it. He doubted X-ray could see it. "No, it's too long and thin to be a shotgun shell," said Magnet. "It's probably just a piece of junk," said Stanley. "Well, I'll show it to Mom," said X-ray. "See what he thinks. Who knows, maybe I'll get the day off." "Your hole's almost finished," said Stanley. "Yeah, so?" Stanley raised and lowered his shoulder. "So, why don't you wait until tomorrow to show it to Mom?" he suggested. "You can pretend you found it first thing in the morning. Then you can get the whole day off instead of just an hour or so this afternoon." X-ray smiled. "Good thinking, caveman." He dropped the tube into his large pocket on the right leg of his dirty orange pants. Stanley returned to his hole. When the water truck came, Stanley started to take his place at the end of the line, but X-ray told him to get behind Magnet, in front of Zero. Stanley moved up 1 place in line. So I want you to think about what that might mean. What does it mean that he moved up 1 place in line? And why is Zero always in the back? Chapter 14. That night, as Stanley lay on his scratchy, smelly cot, he tried to figure out what he could have done differently, but there was nothing he could do. For once in his unlucky life, he was in the right place at the right time, and it still didn't help him. "You got it?" he asked X-ray the next morning at breakfast. X-ray looked at him with half-opened eyes behind his dirty glasses. "I don't know what you're talking about," he grumbled. "You know," said Stanley. "No, I don't know," X-ray snapped. "So just leave me alone, okay? I don't want to talk to you." Stanley didn't say another word. Mr. Sir marched the boys up to the lake, chewing sunflower seeds along the way and spitting out the shells. He scraped the ground with his boot heel to mark where each boy was supposed to dig. Stanley stamped down on the back of the blade of the shovel, piercing the hard, dry earth. He couldn't figure out why X-ray snapped at him. If he wasn't going to produce the tube, why did he make Stanley give it to him? Was he just going to keep it? The tube was gold in color, but Stanley didn't think it was real gold. The water truck came a little after sunrise. Stanley finished his last drop of water and stepped up out of his hole. At this time of day, Stanley sometimes could see some distant hills or mountains on the other side of the lake. They were only visible for a short while and would soon disappear behind the haze of heat and dirt. The truck stopped, and the dust cloud drifted past it. X-ray took his place at the front of the line. Mr. Pendanski filled his canteen. "Thanks, Mom," X-ray said, but he didn't mention the tube. Mr. Pendanski filled all the canteens, then climbed back into the cab of the pickup. He still had to bring water to Group B. Stanley could see them digging about 200 yards away. "Mr. Pendanski!" X-ray shouted from his hole. "Wait! Mr. Pendanski! I think I might have found something." The boys all followed Mr. Pendanski as he walked over to X-ray's hole. Stanley could see the gold tube sticking out of some of the dirt on the end of X-ray's shovel. Mr. Pendanski examined it and took a long look at its flat bottom. "I think the warden is going to like this." "Does X-ray get the day off?" asked Squid. "Just keep digging until someone says otherwise," Mr. Pendanski said. Then he smiled. "But if I were you, Rex, I wouldn't dig too hard." Stanley watched the cloud of dust move across the lake to the cabin beneath the trees. The boys in Group B were just going to have to wait. It didn't take long for the pickup to return. Mr. Pendanski stepped out of the cab. A tall woman with red hair stepped out of the passenger side. She looked even taller than she was, since Stanley was down in his hole. She wore a black cowboy hat and black cowboy boots, which were studded with turquoise stones. The sleeves on her shirt were rolled up and her arms were covered with freckles, as was her face. She walked right up to X-ray. This was where you found it? Yes, ma'am. Your work will be rewarded. She turned to Mr. Pendanski. Drive X-ray back to camp. Let him take a double shower. And give him some clean clothes. But first, I want you to fill everyone's canteen. I just filled them a little while ago, said Mr. Pendanski. The warden stared hard at him. Excuse me, she said. Her voice was soft. I had just filled them when Rex... Excuse me, the warden said again. Did I ask you when you last filled them? No, but it's just... Excuse me? Mr. Pendanski stopped talking. The warden wiggled her finger for him to come to her. It's hot, and it's only going to get hotter, she said. Now, these fine boys have been working hard. Don't you think it might be possible that they might have taken a drink since you last filled their canteens? Mr. Pendanski said nothing. The warden turned to Stanley. Caveman, will you come here, please? Stanley was surprised she knew his name. He had never seen her. Until she stepped out of the truck, he didn't even know the warden was a woman. He nervously went toward her. Mr. Pendanski and I have been having a discussion. Have you taken a drink since Mr. Pendanski last filled your canteen? Stanley didn't want to cause any trouble for Mr. Pendanski. I still got plenty left, he said. Excuse me. He stopped. Yeah, I drank some. Thank you. May I see your canteen, please? Stanley handed it to her. Her fingernails were painted dark red. She gently shook the canteen, letting the water swish inside the plastic container. Do you hear the empty spaces? She asked. Yes, said Mr. Pendanski. Then fill it, she said. And the next time I tell you to do something, I expect you to do it without questioning my authority. If it's too much trouble for you to fill a canteen, I'll give you a shovel. You can dig the hole, and then Caveman can fill your canteen. She turned back to Stanley. I don't think that would be too much trouble for you, would it? No, said Stanley. So what will it be? She asked Mr. Pendanski. Do you want to fill the canteens or do you want to dig? I'll fill the canteens, said Mr. Pendanski. Thank you. Right. So think how Stanley seemed surprised that the warden was a woman, but think, does she seem like a very friendly woman or not so much? All right, next time we'll start with chapter 15.